Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change, our webinar, Sport Conversations for Change. As you all are coming in slowly, we definitely appreciate and welcome you to this space. Feel free to follow us on sjsuwordstoaction.com. Follow us on facebook.com/SJSU Words to Action. And follow us on Twitter with our SJSU Words to Action as well. Welcome again, everybody, to our Sport Conversations for Change. All right, so we've got a wonderful show in front of us today. I think a very thought-provoking program as we are coming together at the beginning of the school year and really dealing with a number of challenges, being in COVID space, and we in California are virtual, teaching remotely the entire semester, and most of our schools in the California state system. So we're operating from our headquarters called home. So we want to send again hellos to everybody out there that are doing this thing, you know, teaching, doing things remotely, homeschooling, as I have off to my left going on. It is a unique time. But with that said, today's conversation is entitled Representation Matters: Equity and Inclusion in Sport. This is the first webinar for our Fall 2020 series. We encourage you to review our past Sport Conversations for Change and join our efforts to move from words to action. I'm Dr. Akila Carter-Francique, the Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change. These past few months, as I've said, have been really more than a notion. They've been filled with moments of sadness, of anger, of reconciliation, and actions of solidarity. The Institute also put out a statement of advocacy and has since been partaking in activist efforts through education, program development, research engagement, and mentoring and consulting. With that said, the mission of the Institute is dedicated to research, analysis, and education at the intersection of sport and society. So again, to learn more about the Institute and how to be a part of change, go to our SJSU Words to Action. Before I get into our show, I wanted to take a moment to introduce you to everyone, our newest member to our team, Dr. Amy August. She's an assistant director for the Institute. And as that, she also has another duty, such as as an assistant professor of sociology at SJSU. She does cultural sociological research on youth, sport, and education and how families choose extracurricular activities. She is currently working on the new project investigating female gymnast activism in the #MeToo movement. I want to say hi to our audience today.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be working with the Institute, and it's great to have you all here today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Awesome. We got more individuals, more wonderful individuals to our community. So I wanted to start off with a little bit, we kind of talk about this notion that representation matters. And I think of our present day sort of representation out of these two sisters, Venus and Serena Williams. We were born sisters, but we've become each other's biggest allies, says Serena. For us, being sisters is everything, on and off the court. We're each other's biggest competitors. We're also each other's greatest, each other's greatest advocates. And so let's watch a little video.
Ever since we were little girls, you've compared us to each other. My game versus her game. My ranking versus her ranking. My titles versus her titles. My Grand Slams versus her Grand Slams. It's funny. You saw two tennis players trying to win a game. We saw two sisters changing it.
So I think of these two sisters as we come to this title of this presentation today, and this notion of representation matters. Their being in this space, again, a lot of them did see, a lot of our public probably saw them as competitors, but different communities saw them as something as more than their mere representation in these spaces. So with that said, over the next hour, Sport Conversations will work to really address the current issues of systemic racism, equity in sport and in society. More specifically, the conversation will address issues of race, equity, and inclusion in athletics and education. In March 2020, after the public killing of George Floyd and the deaths and culminating aftermath of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, the significance of Black Lives Matter would be elevated again, this time with the attention of the world. Sport and athletic competition was and remains the subject of debate. Simultaneously, the Black athlete performance, their lives, their health would also take center stage. So scholars, administrators, and consultants that we have on this platform today will all share and discuss the implications of athletes in sport and the role of race, equity, and inclusion in organizational composition and program delivery. So if you would like to share your story or have a question of interest, please feel free to use our chat box. In addition, we want to know who's in our audience today so our panelists can really have a true understanding of who's here. So as that takes place, we want to sort of get into a little bit of the program and understand. What's going on here? Understand a little bit about the happenings when we talk about, talk about this notion of race. I think many of us have, used this term, this notion of race matters, of representation matters, but it comes from, I think, borrowing a lot from the work of Cornel West. And so if you'll be patient with me, I wanted to read a little something that reflects this notion. Black people in the United States differ from all other modern people owning to the unprecedented levels of unregulated and unrestrained violence directed at them. No other people have been taught systematically to hate themselves. Psychic violence, reinforced by the powers of state and civic coercion, physical violence, for the primary purpose of controlling their minds and exploiting their labor for nearly 400 years. The unique combination of American terrorism, Jim Crow, and lynching, as well as American barbarism, slave trade, and slave labor, bears witness to the distinctive American assault on Black humanity. The vicious ideology and practice of white supremacy has left its indelible mark on all spheres of American life, from the prevailing crimes of Amerindian reservations to the discriminatory realities against Spanish-speaking Latinos to racial stereotypes against Asians. Yet the fundamental litmus test for American democracy is its economic, government, criminal justice system, education, mass media, and culture remains how broad and intense are the arbitrary powers used to deploy against Black people. In this sense, the problem of the 21st century remains the problem of the color line. So we'll get into this notion today with some great, as I said, some very distinguished panelists that I have here. Four amazing individuals that have been doing this work for a long time. We'll talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. We'll talk about the meaning of change. We'll talk about race, equity, and inclusion, and offer some of our best practices based on these scholars here today. So we have with us some, again, and first and foremost, I'll say Dr. Deniese Dortch. She's a visiting assistant professor of higher education administration with the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at George Washington University. Her research and teaching grapples with systemic oppression across multiple axes. She uses critical phenomenology approaches to understand how African American undergraduate and graduate students experience and respond to race and racism at predominantly white institutions of higher education. Her studies, the socialization of undergraduate and graduate students of color. She's especially interested in how psychological violence and fear is experienced, manifested, and reproduced in the academy. Dr. Walt Jacobs, our very own, is the Dean of the College of Social Sciences at San Jose State. He's also one of our esteemed faculty, our members of our faculty advisory board. He's a sociologist. He's the author of Ethnography, Speaking the Lower Frequencies, Students and Media Literacy, and is a co-editor with Dr. Jeffrey DeLeo of If Classrooms Matter, Progressive Visions of Educational Environments. Then we have Jamall Kinard, Executive Director of Lakeview Neighborhood Alliance and trainer of Race Equity Institute, as well as head coach and founder of Conscious Leadership. He is a community organizer, a consultant in North Carolina. He's attended the first REI workshop in 2016, where his life was changed forever. After 10 years of service as an educator and coach in the Charlotte Mecklenburg school system, he eagerly rejoined REI in 2019. And then last, but certainly not least, Dr. John Singer, Associate Professor of Sport Management and Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at Texas A&M. He also serves as one of our Institute's faculty affiliates. He received his PhD, and I have to get this right, from The Ohio State University, and is currently a faculty administrator, again, at A&M. His overarching research agenda is twofold. Number one, Black male studies, and number two, diversity and social justice in and through sport organizations. He's the author of the book, Race, Sport, and Education, Improving Opportunities and Outcomes for Black Male College Athletes. So one of the first questions I want to really ask and express and to get from you all is, what does sport mean to you? I like to understand this to kind of get a baseline of, the meaning of sport, the significance, and we start every show with that. So with that said, Jamall, what does sport mean to you?
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
You good to rock? Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. When we talk about the topic of sport, sport means it's a tool used to help prepare for life. And you can prepare for life in so many different ways, whether that's teamwork, whether that's physically, mentally, skills, but it's also a way to bring people together to provide context for learning about each other's experience. Sports bring people of all races, colors, and creeds together, and I think we can use that as a unique tool to begin to work towards racial equity and things of that nature and really begin to understand each other. So sports mean pretty much everything to me, because it can be used as a tool to prepare each and every one for life and prepare us for the just, fair, and equitable society that we all say that we want. So that's what sport means to me.
Okay, thank you. Denise, what does sport mean to you?
In the most traditional sense, sports means to me an opportunity to compete and to entertain and to build camaraderie and fellowship amongst groups of people or individuals. It's also an amazing opportunity to exercise your platform. It's a way to not only build groups of people and build morale and work toward a common goal also, but it's also a way in which you can communicate leadership and values. And so sport has played an incredible part of my life and of my formation and my upbringing. given that I have 6 siblings. And so for me, small baseball team, and we would play in our backyard. And so it was an amazing opportunity to teach all kinds of skills, just like Jamall just said. And so, like I said, so it's an amazing opportunity to build community, leadership, amazing skills, and to exercise your voice in a way that other platforms won't do.
Right. Dean Jacobs, what does sport mean to you?
You know, I like to tell people, I like to joke that, you know, I'm 6'4", Black man, grew up in the South. Sports in my DNA, you know, had no choice. All the men in my family, all the people in the neighborhood, we played sports, you know, all day long, baseball, football, basketball. Never did hockey. You know, hockey is bigger in the South now. When I was growing up, you know, nobody did hockey. So, you know, it's been part of my life, you know, since I was a boy. But more seriously, you know, really, I was thinking sport for me is kind of like the way Jamall, outlined. You know, it's a way for people to come together from different backgrounds. You know, it's one of the few places in society where people who have very different backgrounds can come together and have these conversations. Sometimes informal, sometimes formal, but it's a great space for discussion about how we can make society better.
John Singer.
So yeah, I echo certainly the sentiments of my fellow panelists, but I would say for me, sport is a powerful social institution and cultural practice that on the one hand has the potential not only to provide career opportunities and other outlets for people, but also to effectuate social change. But then conversely, on the other hand, it also is a space or a setting that mimics or mirrors many of the social ills and forms of oppression that we see in the larger society. So it's a double-edged thing in terms of sports power and potential, and it's something I really grapple with in my book that Dr. Carter-Francique referenced earlier.
Yeah. Sport has much meaning, and I'm interested to hear from our audience today. And feel free to use the chat of what sport means to you. In 1 or 2 words, what does sport mean to you as we sort of wrap our heads around this notion and move into our first topic here of, you know, really trying to understand and unpack diversity, equity, and inclusion. What you have before is an image I think we often see of equality and equity. And so with that said, some use the term diversity, some use the term diversity and inclusion, some use diversity, equity, inclusion, race equity, anti-racism, anti-racist work. And so I wanted to really kind of understand before we dive into this, so we're all on the same page. Jamall, could you unpack for us what, you know, this notion of diversity, equity, inclusion?
Of course. For me, diversity is one of those words that, you know, can really be ambiguous, right? You kind of have so many different meanings. You can have diversity in age, diversity in experiences where you come from, but, you know, I really want to really be key. For me, diversity is racial diversity. When we talk about racial equity, we need to be circumspect and speaking directly to it, right? Looking at the history of this country, we got to see who's been on the monopoly board for over 250 years before other people even got the chance to play, right? And when you look at that in that context, you know, Dr. Mutijos out of North Carolina A&T State University, she has a study called when the rules are fair, but the game isn't. When she talks about the monopoly game. And if you're not sure about how to go about describing the problem as a racial diversity and equity problem, people won't attempt to solve a problem that they don't believe exists. So we have to be circumspect and speaking directly to it and calling the problem what it is. No matter where we go, the outcomes are the same in this country. We can go west, we can go east, we can go north, we can go south, we can go midwest. White people at the top, black people at the bottom, other races of people are somewhere in between. that doesn't happen by circumstance. That doesn't happen by coincidence. That is a system directly in place, and race is the major indicator of outcomes today in this country. So we have to be very, very clear of calling it what it is. Diversity should be seen as racial equity, and then, you know, you can go from there. But we have to be looking at the culture of this country, the dawn of it, what has happened, and speak very, very directly to the problem so that we can begin to fix the problem. I like to think about it as fish, lake, and groundwater, right? You know, if it's one fish, Billy up dead, at Racial Equity Institute, we use this metaphor. But if we said we're having this conversation around a lake close to anybody, in Charlotte, we got Lake Norman. But say we're having this discussion at the Lake Norman, and on the bank, we see one fish, Billy up dead. We may ask some very surface question, like what happened to that fish? Did the fish get caught up in disgruntled fisherman equipment? Did the fish swim too close to the bank and then didn't have enough energy to get back? We may ask some deep questions. Did that fish have on a fish hoodie when swimming through the wrong fish neighborhood? Did that fish not go to the right fish school? Did that fish not read the right fish book? Did that fish grow up in a one single parent fish household? But it's one fish. So we'll go on with our day and act like, you know, we'll forget about it before you know it. But if we come back the next day and have the same conversation at that same lake, and we see 10,000 fish Billy up dead now, we're no longer asking what happened to that fish. We're now saying, man, there got to be something going on with the water. And I say to you right now in America, there's something terribly wrong with the water. But we've been trained, credentialed, rewarded, and paid very, very healthy salaries to fix fish. And nobody wants to direct their attention to the systems or to the lake. And somebody said, well, we can clean up one lake, an education system or a law enforcement system, but then we got to think about the groundwater, because all of our bodies of water here in America is connected through the groundwater. Over 90% of the fresh liquefied water is in the groundwater, and the groundwater feeds into the lake. So the groundwater is the culture. Groundwater equals the culture, lakes equal the systems, fish equal the fish. So we want to really talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to understand how the problem works from the culture level, how it affects our systems, and how it impacts the outcomes of the people. And I think we got to be very circumspect and look at how race played a major part in that. So for me, diversity has to be racial diversity, equity, and inclusion. Once we get there, we can begin to look at other forms of diversity in our systems, and especially in sports. So that's what it means to me.
Thank you so much for that great analogy. Denise, same question, you know, particularly in the higher ed spaces, and I know you're working with young people as well, you know, how do we sort of unpack these different terminologies of diversity, equity, inclusion, racist work?
Okay, so when it comes to diversity, first of all, thank you for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share space with esteemed panelists. Second of all, while I agree with with Jamall's analogy, I've actually never heard it phrased quite like that. So I think that that's fantastic, that when he's talking about diversity, he thinks of racial diversity. And I do too. But that said, diversity, the word itself means it's really, really broad, right? So it's a term that has almost rendered itself a bit useless because it's so broad to include lots of other things like nationality and religion and veteran status and marital status and language and age and gender identity and orientation and all sorts of things, right? And so essentially that is diversity. But equity, on the other hand, is creating a system of fair treatment, access, and opportunity for everyone. So thinking about that photo that you had where everyone could see above the fence, another way of looking at it is just to remove the fence, right? So to remove the actual barrier that exists for everyone so that there are no barriers, so that everyone has equal opportunity and access for full participation. So that's essentially what equity is. And to be inclusive is to authentically bring in the groups that have been traditionally and historically excluded in the past, and bringing them into spaces where they can participate fully in decision making, in policy making, in a way that shares power and access and opportunities and resources. And so essentially, that is what inclusion really is. And that is where we are missing out in higher education spaces, in equitable spaces, higher education institutions. It is a space of violence, both physically and psychologically. And so it is very, very difficult for institutions to sort of meet these needs because we are operating in a space that is historically violent and historically racist and oppressive against, you know, marginalized people, historically marginalized people, Black people, people of color. And so that's essentially like, so if someone was watching this and said, what is the actual definitions? What I said are actual definitions. And then what Jamall said is applied. You can take that and apply it to the definitions that I just gave. And so essentially, that's what it is. But there are a lot of words, right? A lot of words, like what does it mean to be anti-Black? What's systemic racism? What is institutional racism? What is whiteness? What is white supremacy? What is, so there's all of these things. And so later, little plug, Dr. Carter Francique is going to give you some resources. And so she will share a tool that has a glossary of all the terms you ever wanted to know and some you didn't. And so to give you an actual sense, and it's just racialequitytools.org. And so it's a site that I go to quite a bit. And so it's not a secret. And so now you all will know it too. And so I think it's important that we get the language together so that we can all name it appropriately. And I think some of the reasons why we haven't been as effective as we could be is because we're all going by different names of things. And so if we don't properly address what the thing is, like this is psychologically violent or this is violent racism is violent. Like let's be clear, it is violent, right? Higher education institutions are violent. They are, right? So if we can all get on the same page about what something is, then we can all be able to address it effectively.
Thank you so much. Naming it, you know, is very important. One of the things I want us to unpack here is to John, you know, explain the historical significance of this work and of the positions of D&I officers, administrators, in organizations and business to include higher education, the development of policies and procedures, recruitment and retention, tenure and promotion, and in sport, hiring, training and education, corporate social responsibility. So basically in this notion, since the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, we've viewed what some would consider a reactive display of people and organizations through the release of Black Lives Matter statements and the hiring of diversity officers. Help us understand the behavior of this practice.
Yeah, so we've had a quote unquote diversity problem from the very beginning, right, of many modern societies, particularly the USA, kind of to some of the points the previous panelists mentioned, particularly when race was used to create hierarchies, binaries, and systems of gross injustice. So if you fast forward from a historical perspective to the civil rights era of the 1960s, where you had affirmative action. In the 70s and 80s, you began to see this shift in language, and there's been research articles published that talks about how affirmative action, which focuses more on social justice, became diversity management, which focuses more on the quote unquote business case for diversity. There's an article written by a management scholar named Roosevelt Thomas who talks about this notion of from affirmative action to affirming diversity. And so many organizations, higher ed and the sport industry and corporate America, began to realize that if you don't pay attention, if you think about the changing demographics, the shifting demographics, particularly from a racial standpoint, but not just that, even from a gender standpoint, with more women in the workplace and being empowered, and then other diversity dimensions that we could talk about, you know, people living longer from an age standpoint and working longer. This all had an effect on the bottom line within organizations. So these leaders at the top began to realize that we have to figure out a way to quote unquote manage this diversity. And that's when you began to see chief diversity officers across these different industry sectors. And so as somebody who sits in such a position as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion in the College of Education and Human Development at A&M, I'm close to this work and the importance of those of us in these roles. A lot of people talk about these positions being marginalized and lacking in power, but from my perspective, I look at it as I have a seat at the table to have those important discussions around recruitment, retention, climate, and equity in institutions of higher education in particular, and to help in terms of thought leadership. And it's important to have a dean, in my case, who believes in it and empowers me to do the work that's required to address the water, as Brother Jamall talked about. So I'll stop there, and we can talk more about it going forward.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. So Dean, do you believe that organizations, some that have created these positions prior to April 2020, will acknowledge, listen, and embrace and sort of adhere to these efforts? In other words, do you feel the notion of race, equity, and inclusion will be received and given the respect to change the culture? I ask this because of how social institutions are influenced by culture, political regimes at all levels, institutional, local, regional, national, economics as well. How do those things sort of kind of come together?
Great question. And I'd start off by kind of seconding what John was talking about earlier. You know, having these folks at the table is so important. Having that voice there so folks can question some of the decisions that are being made, saying, you may want to rethink that, or bring some new ideas to the table. So this is not always by choice. So businesses, you know, corporate America, sport, higher educations, you know, they're businesses. So first and foremost, they exist to make money. So I think a lot of these statements, these positions that have been created, you know, they perceive that if they don't do that, their customers are going to go away. So their customers are demanding that we need to have these actions taken. So I think that's one of the big reasons that we're seeing more of that now. You know, we're really at a historic moment where the U.S. is paying more attention to racial violence, racial inequality, police brutality, specifically against Black people. The question is, how long is this moment going to last? So right now, everybody's listening, right? Everybody's trying to do the right thing. People are trying to put programs in place. The question is going to be, how long is it going to last? You know, I'm seeing things I thought would never happen. In the NFL, for instance, Roger Goodell saying we should have listened to Colin Kaepernick, you know, right? I never expected him to say that, right? But he was kind of forced to do it now. And so, you know, we're at a point where some change can happen, and let's see what happens. To me, I think a really interesting case is the WNBA. You know, the work that they're doing, the advocacy that those players are really doing some good work there, in part because they've got people in the front office who know about these issues, who care. So they were able to say, we need to support the players on this, even though you got some of the owners, you know, trying to make it political and trying to roll back some of the progress that we're making. So I'm cautiously optimistic that, you know, we'll continue to make some good progress.
Okay. Thank you with that. With that, we're going to move to our next area, is really trying to unpack this notion of the meaning of change. Utilizing this quote here, change is a process. It's not an event. It's not something that we can easily just check off and say, hey, we went to that training, or we had this one session and discussion. It's an ongoing process. So with that said, I want to get a quick take from each of you about the significance of this change process, the significance of equity inclusion for respective groups. So again, just sort of a quick snapshot of what is the importance of that. So with Denise, what is the significance of equity inclusion for students?
It is everything for students. It links back to their own sense of belonging, their own sense of culture, community, and it's at institutions of higher ed, when we think about students, they are an important resource. We can't have school without them. And so for them, as we're shifting, as we're in historic times, students ideally are changing along with them, or at least are indicating their sort of activist spirit, and we are seeing that. School just started, right? And school just started, and many students are already protested, right? So they're exercising their agency, exercising racial agency in ways that we haven't seen in some time. And so it all goes back to really thinking about what does institutional transformation mean? And when you say change is a process, not it really is. It takes a significant amount of time to affect real social change at an institution. And a lot of the times it really does start with the students. And so I just wanted to go back to something really quick that Walt mentioned earlier. And he didn't say this, but I'm saying it. I hope you don't feel like I'm putting words in your mouth, but it's really all about interest convergence, right? So institutions will move when they believe it is in their best interest to do so. And students, as the clients, as the customers, as the drivers of tuition and income, have an opportunity to be able to exercise their voice in ways, and their dollars in ways that can change an institution. So students are saying, I only want to attend a striving anti-racist institution, and institutions all of a sudden start to see their numbers drop. We will start to see mission statements change, okay? We will start to see hiring practices change. We will start to see statements change. We will start to see these elaborate, as we're starting to see a shift now. It's not in a way that I'm satisfied with, but we are starting to see some movement now where you have presidents and provosts condemning racism, using the words racism. My God, like, to even get them to say it it's not just a notion, like you said earlier. And so we're really starting to see them demonstrate some leadership and some courage in the face of potentially having alums that aren't on board with this anti-racism movement, or other donors that might not be so on board with this anti-racism movement. And so, when we're thinking about change and thinking about students and how they are impacted and how they can impact this process, they can and often are at the center of it. And so it's just helping to empower them to recognize that they have a voice and that they can use it effectively, and especially when in critical mass.
Thank you. Thank you. Same question to John. This notion, what is the significance of equity inclusion for student athletes and coaches?
Yeah, so athletes and coaches are really central to the spectacle of sport that has become this multi-billion-dollar industry that it is. So when you think specifically about Black athletes and Black coaches, such as the late, great John Thompson from Georgetown, head men's basketball coach who recently left us, when they come to spaces such as historically white colleges and universities, they have literally and figuratively changed the face and trajectory of such institutions. So equity and inclusion means everything for them. And I think that's what we're seeing play out.
Yeah.
That this current wave, as Dr. Edwards talks about, of athlete activism. I know we'll get into here soon. So equity and inclusion means everything for athletes in general, but Black athletes and coaches in particular in these spaces.
Thank you. Walt, same thing, significance of inclusion for faculty and staff.
Oh, great question for faculty and staff. First, I would definitely want to thank Denise for definitely telling us about the interests. I agree 100%. When the institution perceives its interests as threatened or changing, they're going to act. I think we're seeing that now in many institutions of higher education. So, as Denise mentioned, the presidents are condemning racism. They didn't really do that as much in the past. Question for me now is, okay, that's great. What are you going to do next? What's the systematic change you're going to do? So many institutions, like for our own institution, San Jose State, we a lot of times we say, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, 50 years ago, they took the stand, changed the world. That's great, but that was 50 years ago. What are you doing now? So I'm happy that we're thinking about, we're implementing new hiring plans, right, to specifically diversify the faculty, bring additional faculty of color into the institution, and those faculty who study these issues, racial disparities, in health disparities, for instance, one of the clusters that we're thinking about doing. So I think it's really important for the institutions to not only say they value diversity, equity, and inclusion, but actually put programs into place that will enact those perspectives. And again, I'm cautiously optimistic. Again, at San Jose State, we got some good conversations going, but it's gonna, this is a 400-year-old problem. It's gonna take some years to fix. So hopefully, we're gonna sustain the momentum and continue to grow it.
Thank you so much. And Jamall, again, same question, and I think it's going to get at a little bit with one of our, I guess wants to know, Anthony Weems is out there, but the significance of equity and inclusion for organizations like athletic departments in their interactions with the community, like boosters, alumni, and non-BIPOC communities, so people of color. What is the significance of this?
Yeah, well, I for one believe that a conscious and consistent investment in culture and leadership through a racial equity lens will indeed change the world. Mm-hmm. So if that will change the world, it will indeed change organizations, right? Because when culture of an organization, of an institution is hidden, that's when false narratives thrive. Because now our minds are meaning-making machines, so we don't even have to have the facts. We can just come up with our own opinion and hold that near and dear to our heart and then go spewing it like poison all over the organization, all throughout the institution. So I would say for organizations to begin to drill down to what is the true culture and get to the true facts, you have to know the top 6 areas that plague the Black community. If you're wanting to better serve the Black athletes in your program, or the Latinx athletes, you got to understand what's going on in their community, because they're only an athlete for a certain amount of time. We're seeing that now, and when they go back into their hometown after they graduate, or even doing break over the summer, they're just seen as a person now. So the top 6 areas that plague the Black community: number 1, miseducation. We got to talk about the role that higher education plays in that. Think about the Eurocentric, Anglo-Saxon culture of our school system, right? The way we test kids, our geography, our literature, our history, the way the Bell schedule, the way we test kids is all Eurocentric. So we're talking about being this great place where different cultures and creeds are accepted, but we only teaching one main curriculum throughout our whole education system here in America. So miseducation is number 1. Number 2, mass incarceration. Think about the number of Black men and women are in jail. 1 in 3 Black men will go to jail at some point in their life. And I think it's 1 in 9 Black women, compared to 1 in 16 white men. And I think it's like 1 in 111 white women. So look at those numbers, and going a little further, look at gentrification. What's going on in our communities around housing, affordable housing. Look at police brutality we've been seeing in the news. That's number 5. And number 6 is healthcare disparities and environmental disparities going on. It's staggering for me to understand that white women with GEDs are having better birth outcomes than Black women with advanced degrees. So if we're not seeing how these things are plaguing the Black community, how can we ever bring diversity, equity, and inclusion to a program to serve and better serve the people from the staff all the way down to the students in our institutions and programs, if we don't even understand the true nature of the culture that's producing these desperate outcomes in our system. So I think it has to be culture development through a racial equity lens, and we have to get the direct information and the right information to begin to do that and do it effectively. So that's what it means to me. That's the significance of it.
Beautiful, and thank you for sharing that. I know we had a program a few weeks ago that spoke to HBCUs and the experience of students that are in that space. Again, historically Black colleges and institutions, and really tried to unveil some of the inequities that are happening for those students and those communities and bring them to light and how it affects their sport participation, to the point of motherhood and birthing. Serena Williams brought that to the fore during her own lived experience. So we're seeing this exchange happen in that space. I think another thing to continue to get on this vein of entrance convergence, I had to bring this to light. The story just came out. I thought it was really quite interesting with regards to, the President of the United States said that he would withhold funding for federal organizations that hosted diversity training and the espousal of critical race theory. So this goes to Dr. Singer, because again, as a brother doc, as a CRT scholar, what is your interpretation of this? And real quick before you go, before you make your statement, in the letter, Voight told the agency heads to identify contracts or other spending related to training on critical race theory, white privilege, or any other training or propaganda effort that teaches or suggests either one, that the United States is inherently racist or an evil country, or two, that any racist or race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. What is your thinking about this, particularly in terms of not only higher education, but this role of what you do as a diversity and equity individual and to sport?
Yeah, so, this notion of implicit bias training has become quite popular right across institutions of higher education and corporate America and other social spaces. And as long as you're talking about the individual, right? So looking at your own biases and changing your biases, you're focused on the individual level, but not the institutional level. Mm-hmm. People like these so-called quote unquote elite white males. It's to that question that Anthony Weems talked about. He's referring to a book by Joe Fagan and Kimberly Doucet that talks about the elite white male dominance system that has duped us all in many ways and has been, just vicious over the course of centuries. And so as long as you're doing those kind of trainings that focuses more on the individual and not the institution, which CRT, just to give everybody a quick crash course, it's really an academic and activist movement that was birthed from the social missions and struggles of the 1960s civil rights movement, right? And the basic thing that unites all CRT scholars across different disciplines is their first goal to understand how a regime of so-called white supremacy has permeated not only the legal system, but other social institutions. And secondly, and most importantly, seeking to change that bond that exists between racial power and privilege. So, of course, the president doesn't want that type of teaching being instilled within the hearts and minds of students at universities like Texas A&M or in organizations across industries, because it really upsets the apple cart and that white male privilege and perceived power that has existed for centuries, that affirmative action for white men that has dominated this country for centuries.
Whew, it's a lot. But it's interesting to me, just to sort of follow up in that critical race theory has, as you said, this historical movement, but we see it in almost every aspect of what we do, of scholars making a difference, whether it be in sport, whether it be in education, whether it be in disability. I even, identified in accounting. So that language and those efforts are being taught in many different spaces and places. So I thank you for your input and sort of speaking to that for our audience today. With that said, I think it's important that we sort of move to this notion of sort of action, right? We've heard a lot of the history. We've understood some of the terms and definitions, which are definitely great. So with that said, we have a number of institutions and organization agencies that again have made statements, promoted symbols to advocate. Some efforts were well thought out where others were not. What were your or sort of reactions to these efforts when we talk about race, equity, and inclusion? What were some of your initial sort of reactions to those movements and to those changing ideologies or maybe new mission statements, as Denise mentioned, that got forged and new positions coming together? And so I'm going to go with Walt. What do we think about that?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that many of the institutions are putting these statements out now because they have to. So the question is going to be what happens when the spotlight inevitably turns to the next crisis in the country. What's going to happen at that point? So I'm optimistic that many institutions are taking their time to consult widely, consulting with the faculty, consulting with the staff, bringing in new folks, developing structures to examine the issues on their campuses. So many campuses, for instance, police brutality, police violence is an issue on and off campus. So many institutions are developing task forces to study the issue and then make changes. Some institutions, one of my previous institutions was University of Minnesota. They severed ties with the Minneapolis Police Department because of the issues in that unit. So now, they don't contract with that police department anymore. So I think, again, it's the jury's still out. I think institutions are doing what they perceive they have to do. And we'll just see, if they build any lasting changes. Another interesting thing is happening too is that the student athletes are recognizing their power. So they're putting together statements saying we're not going to play until you make these particular changes, right? So that is very powerful. I think sometimes it's difficult for institutions when the student athletes have a difference of opinion. So football, for instance, big time football, we're seeing some groups. Pac-12, their manifesto, you gotta make these changes before we play. But then in the ACC, they're saying we want to play. It's better for us to be on campus rather than back in our communities where we might get more sick. So two very different, opinions about what to do. But I think the important thing is to engage student athletes. Don't have this paternalistic attitude where we know what's better. Let's engage them. Bring them to the table, have some conversations, decide together what we're going to do going forward.
And I thank you for that response, because it kind of gets into the next question is when we look at many of these institutions of higher education, when we look at many of these sport organizations, they're typically, and as we've seen even through Dr. Richard Lapchick's, annual racial and gender report card, they're led by white males, right? And white individuals. So what do you tell those individuals that want to be supportive and are trying to assist in sort of moving the needle, but may not have the education, may not have the knowledge, may not know exactly what to do or say, and perhaps fear of offending or just, again, lack of sort of that educational understanding? What do you tell them in order to help them become an ally? And so I put this to Jamall and also to Denise. What do you tell them in this notion of allyship?
Well, again, I'm going to stay consistent with what I've been talking about all day, and that's culture. Right? I believe that culture eats strategy for lunch. So you can come with all kind of programs and strategies and things of that nature. If you're not understanding the impacts of the culture that it has on the systems and on the people, you're just putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg, right? The broken leg will eventually heal, but you're going to be walking with a limp. It's going to be pretty painful. It's going to be very noticeable. But the way that you have to go back in, you got to go in and reset that leg, give it the proper treatment so that that person with the broken leg can begin to really walk the way that he or she's supposed to walk. And I say that diagnosis determines treatment, right? If we are misdiagnosing something, you're not giving it the proper treatment. So culture eats strategy for lunch, and we have to be very, very clear about the culture that's in our institutions. Like I'm kind of taking some page out of Deniese. We don't want to say racism, and we don't like to say white supremacy either. but it is what it is. In the individuality symbols, that's a part of white supremacy culture when it comes to dealing with people of color, specifically Black people. And what we say at the Racial Equity Institute is charity and symbols is an unacceptable excuse for injustice. You've given contracts and wealth building opportunities to a group of people when they were down and out. But when it comes to Black and brown people, we just get your charity. We get the midnight basketball game. We get the mentor program. We get the backpack. We get the free lunch program. But nobody wants to give us a contract and give us the resources that we rightfully should have in order to rebuild our communities, receive the mental health, deal with the trauma that we're supposed to deal with so we can economically build a base for ourselves and be self-sustaining. So I say that you got to be aware of the culture first and foremost, before you start just putting in programs, putting in goods and services, because people are not poor because they lack our programs, goods, and services. People are poor and deal what they deal with because they lack power. And if we're not in the business of giving power back to the people, you are just putting a band-aid on a broken leg. You don't really understand the culture that has led to how we're situated today. So culture eats strategy for lunch. Let's be clear about the culture that's in our institutions and our systems and begin to clean that up. And then we can come up with the right strategy, the right program, the right things need to be in place that can actively affect the people in the way that it should be affected.
Okay. I mean, again, I appreciate that notion of culture. Denise, is there something that, you know, we can continue to think about in this process? And I think I also want to have John chime in here a little bit as well.
I think first and foremost, we have to agree that something needs to be done, and the people at the table don't agree, right? Because there are certain people who believe in the fundamental ideology of white supremacy, right? No matter what they look like, if they believe in that system, then they're going to continue to perpetuate that system, yeah? And then if there are people like me that are like, hey, wait a minute, power's supposed to be shared. We're supposed to do this together. No, we're not. So we all have to agree institutionally, if we're talking about like institutions of higher education, if we're talking about systemic change, what Jamall was talking about is institutional transformational change, right? When you change the culture of an institution, then that'll trickle down and begin to change systems and structures once you change that, which is why I constantly go back to sort of mission statements. And this is why this is important. Because every institution has a mission statement, right? And whatever is in that mission, that institution has a duty, a legal duty to uphold, a legal duty, which is why usually they're so vague and they're super broad, so because they have a legal duty to uphold it. Now, if you start there in your mission, right, to indicate that you want to be like an anti-racist institution, that means that legally now you have a duty to uphold that. So that means that every college at that institution has to uphold that. That means that all your hiring practices, your curriculum has to fall in line, right? So in doing that, you then begin to change institutional systems. Well, who comes up with mission statements? Well, boards of trustees. Now let's look at the demographic makeup of boards of trustees. Those are predominantly white men in business who are over the ages of 50. So if that's like the average board, right? And boards help to create mission statements, right? And if we're in a society that is willing to uphold white supremacy, then why on earth would they do that? So when we're thinking about transformational change, right, then it has to start there. It has to start with that statement, because then everything after that has to fall in line. Now, how many institutions in this country have a mission statement that claims to be anti-racist? Oh, Dr. Dortch, I would like to know. Well, let me tell you. Like none. Okay, except I will give it to Beloit College, which underneath their purpose, their mission statement, underneath that, like right underneath, they say we are a striving anti-racist institution. They came up with that in 2005. Y'all check out Beloit College. No, I did not go there, but they have that statement. And then they reaffirmed that, I believe, in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. So while I hold them up as an example of actually having the courage to do that when it wasn't popular, when, you know, there wasn't like a mass movement, when it didn't look like, when lots of other institutions weren't doing it, they were doing it. And so much of their curriculum, the way that they hire people, the questions that they ask, the way in which they teach, like all falls underneath that principle. And so I'm not just talking about value statements that include the words diversity, and yet when we hire folks, there's like one Black person in the college, if at all, right? Or, and I'm also speaking as someone who is one of very few Black women faculty in her school, okay? So I'm saying, like, when we're thinking about allyship and what allies are people, first of all, I have to tell you that you are an ally. You cannot call yourself an ally. You can say that you are an advocate for racial justice, but until that oppressed group or that marginalized group actually names you as an ally, you are not. So let's be clear about that. But for those folks who want to take that on and say that they're an ally, if you are in a position where you can effectively make change, where you can have a hand or a say in some decision-making matters where these issues come up, bring it up. You do not have to wait for me or someone who looks like me to show up. And if you're scared and if you're afraid to do it, speak anyway. I personally don't have the luxury of shutting up. I don't have the privilege of saying, let me just get my bearings and let me just be quiet and wait and hope that maybe one day somebody is going to say and do the right thing. It's not about interest convergence for me. It's about what is morally correct, and white supremacy is like it is the thing that is hurting our educational system, right? That's the thing that's hurting us, right? And so knowing that, if I believe that education is about serving the public good, white supremacy is the antithesis of serving the public good. So if we can agree on that, then we can start.
Thank you. Thank you. John, I know you wanted to weigh in with this response as well. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, let me keep it brief. So to this point of white allyship, white leadership, helping athletes, historian John Henrik Clarke once said that one true purpose of education is to help students to realize their power and then help them recognize how to use it responsibly.
Right.
So when we think about athlete activism and the role of white leaders and allies in facilitating that, I'll say two things. First and foremost, listen to the athletes. One of the things I did in my role as chair of the athletics council here at A&M is we were sitting around each month talking about these athletes and their welfare, but we didn't invite them to the table to discuss these issues with us. So that was one of the first things I did. Let's start bringing these athletes to the table and listening to them. Athletes past, present, and future. So that's the first thing. And in fact, that was the focal point of my book, is really illuminating the voices of these Black male athletes. Second, follow the examples of other white leaders like Greg Popovich, Pete Carroll, and others, Steve Kerr, who are using their white male privilege and platforms to speak up and speak out against this stuff. And so I think if you want suggestions as white leaders and white allies, look to those examples. And then finally, just be humble, in the words of the poet Kendrick Lamar. Humble yourself.
Right.
And that can go a long ways.
Thank you. Thank you.
Akilah, can I add just one quick thing?
Oh, yes, please do.
I mean, one other thing I think is very important, if you are a coach or an administrator, especially a white coach or administrator, and you're called out about something that you've done wrong, give a real apology, right? Apologize for it and move forward rather than this non-apology. So I'm thinking of Sherry Cole, the head coach of the Oklahoma women's basketball. So she was recently called out about some of the stuff she said, and she gave the standard non-apology. You know, I'm sorry if anybody was offended. It was not my intent, right? Give a real apology and learn and move forward.
Yeah. And to that, I want to just stay with all of us on this, just to kind of give a quick understanding. This work is much. Okay, this work in many ways, you know, we experience this notion of cultural taxation. It can be tiring, it can be exhausting. What keeps you inspired to keep doing this? What keeps you inspired and engaged to keep supporting? And just again, real quick, because we're going to move into this notion of best practices, that I want everybody to really get that information as well. But what keeps you moving forward doing this work? Whoa.
I think for me, it's the students, really. You know, they, you know, again, as an institution of higher education, we're here for the students. So that's what we're all about. And the students are so resilient. They've got so much going on, especially for students at institutions like San Jose State University, especially the student athletes. In addition to going to class, you know, some have childcare responsibilities, some have elder care responsibilities, some have jobs, or they don't have jobs. Some students have jobs, but just doing all that, especially in times of the pandemic, you know, all the craziness of this happened on top of this. So just seeing them and seeing how excited they are to not only, you know, improve their own situations, but also to improve their communities. That's inspiring to me, right? So they're here getting their education to not only improve their lives, but the lives of others as well. And I see that every day. That keeps me going.
Great. Jamall.
I think what inspires me is the opportunity to speak truth to power. Truth is what inspires me the most out of everything, especially in doing this work. When we all begin to understand the falseness of the old American story, I would hope that we will begin to work together to build a new and true one that doesn't involve hierarchy and class, but it involves a network of friends and neighbors working together to truly build a just, fair, and equitable society for all. So the slogan I live by is make history now. And I want us to really begin to understand the truth so that we can make history now together. That's what keeps me going. Truth. Truth is what keeps me going and what brings us together.
John. And one of his gorgeous young daughters.
Sitting next to me, I mean, her journey justice. So justice, the pursuit of justice is what inspires me. And she has her middle name because of that. She's waving. But beyond that is my students, particularly my doctoral students that I've worked with past and present here at A&M. So a lot of them are on this call today. So shout out to Dr. Rosselli, shout out to Dr. Kwame Ajiman, shout out to Dr. Christy Oshiro, shout out to Dr. Anthony Weems. And if Dr. Justin Garner is on here, shout out to him. And so they inspire me and keep me motivated, right, through doctoral seminars and the work and collaborations we do. So shout out to them.
Denise.
What keeps me motivated is knowing that I'm not doing it alone. Every time we hire another person who has just as much fervor towards racial equity and justice as me, brings me great pleasure and joy, and knowing that I have comrades in the struggle. And so that helps me to stay motivated when there's an issue that happens and I feel like I have community and people that I can go to, that I can process issues with. Helps to keep me motivated and rejuvenated in times when honestly we should be getting hazard pay for the work that we are required to do, the extra labor we're expected to do during a time like this when we have to compartmentalize and do all of this juggling, when all of this violence is happening to us and around us.
Great. Well, I wanted to move us into, again, just sort of getting into some of the best practices, particularly Jamall, the efforts that you and your organization have taken to, again, move groups and organizations forward in this. So I wanted you to take a moment real quick to talk about this problem-solving wheel. I think it's good that we're having a great, robust conversation, but one of the things I want our audience out there to understand, sort of, what is the first step? What is the first step?
Yeah, but definitely, you see the problem-solving wheel here on the screen, but the first step, I would say, first and foremost, is a quote by James Baldwin. He says, "I had to vomit up everything that I had been taught about myself and that I had subconsciously internalized before I began to walk this earth as though I truly belong here." And for us, on every racial category, we have to understand what's on the inside of us that we need to get out. So we need to unlearn a lot of things so that we can be open to learning some new things, right? And once you do that as a personal journey, when you're talking about organizing both inside of systems and outside of systems, here's the steps you can follow with this problem-solving wheel. Number one, you have to get an awareness, right? You have to be aware of what's going on. What is truly the problem? Once you have that awareness of it, you begin to gather more information, frameworks, theories, statistics, so that you can begin to create the next step, an analysis of what it is this information is presenting to you. Once you have that analysis, now you can go back to what Deniese says, creating a direct and a strategic plan that speaks about anti-racist work. Now you don't use those broad, ambiguous terms no more. Once you have a true analysis, you get down to what it really is. Once you have that vision and that plan, then you take action. Once you take action, you have to evaluate that action, right? And once you evaluate, you now have a new awareness of how to move forward, and around you continue to go. What's the problem in this country and in our systems and institutions and people who want to get involved? We go from awareness straight to action. We skip 3 steps. We skip the 3 most important steps because we feel this urge to want to do something, but we don't have information. We don't have the right analysis. We don't even have a vision of what success looks like. So when you go from awareness straight to action, you almost do more harm than you do good. And now you don't have a way to sustain yourself. So now, as a lot of these companies say, hey, we're here, we're allies, you did something, you went from awareness to action, you don't have no evaluation plan in place, you don't have no next step plan in place, you just did something that sounds good. And we got to go from having symbols to get into substance. So those are the 6 steps I tell everybody to follow: awareness, information gathering, analysis, vision and planning, action, then evaluation, and then you have a new awareness. So this is what we believe at the Racial Equity Institute is how we begin to truly organize in the work of building a just, fair, and equitable society for all when it comes to racial equity. So that's what I would say are best practices of what I've seen as far as organizing both in systems and outside of systems in your community.
Great, thank you, thank you. In our last few minutes, I want to just continue to roll through some best practices and for each of our panelists to share some of the work that they're doing to move the needle forward. In addition to, yes, our REI, we also understand that, groups are making efforts. We see right now by our own faculty, actually executive advisory member, Mark Spears, that works with ESPN's Undefeated, highlighted a story with the NBA, WNBA teaming up for this Team Up for Change. So we're seeing some efforts that are happening at the professional level, again, to move the needle forward. I think in addition to that, I'm going to do a soft plug for we here at the Institute. In November 12th and 13th, we're going to have our first Sports Society and Social Change Conference, where we'll get into and sort of continue the conversation we're having today, moving words to action under this guise and this notion of reimagining sport in the age of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. So we want groups, organizations to come with your questions, your problems, your concerns, even some of the best practices that you've identified to this space to share with this community, to network and to engage in doing some of that work. We'll listen to some words on one day, get some information, as Jamall said, do some analysis, and come back and then begin to move our programs forward. So please be on the lookout for this information with the Institute on our various social media platforms. As always, please follow us, you know, visit us, and we're definitely please give to the Institute for our future programming so we can continue to hold webinars such as this, continue to hold conference spaces and workshops to engage all of you all in this movement and in this effort. At this time, I wanted to get from, to mention here, Dr. Dortch has her own website and information and where she will be next. So with that said, tell us where you'll be next and what we should look forward to with your work.
So great question on where I'll be next. Where I am currently is still George Washington. And so
Program
the work that I do is I have my own racial justice transformation series. If people are interested in that work, I also do consulting work, and then I do anti-racist trainings for institutions around the country. So if you are interested in some of the things that I've had to say, my own scholarship looks at psychological violence, and I talk about racial agency and those sorts of things. And so if you are interested in doing that, you can contact me either through DeniseDortch.com or to my email at GW, which is Dortch at gw.edu. Before we sort of wrap up, Akila, there were a couple of like Q&A questions. I wasn't sure if you...
Yeah, I'm getting ready to get into those after I go through all of our resources real quick. We're going to go back into some Q&A. So we know where she's at, got these sources here. Next, I wanted to highlight Jamall.
Definitely. I would say you can check out what we're doing in the Lakeview community around rebuilding Black and brown and marginal communities here in Charlotte. We have a blueprint that we call Community Impact Organizations, and the impact stands for individuals making progress and change together. So if you can go to give.classy.org/Lakeview for that. The Racial Equity Institute, somebody asked the question of how can I understand what's plaguing the culture, what's going on in the culture. I would recommend going to the racialequityinstitute.com website, signing up for our 2-day training, our phase 1, or signing up for our groundwater training. You get a crash course on how racial equity and systemic racism works in this country. And last but not least, makehistorynowbck.com. That's my website. For the clothing apparel I have on that I wear, that kind of helps me make a statement for everything I do, say, and wear. But also that's my consulting agency too, Conscious Leadership, where you can learn more about that work. So I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina right now, but thankfully through this virtual platform, we can be all over the world and sharing this message around racial equity.
Thank you. Our own Dean, Dr. Walt Jacobs, share a little bit about this, our wonderful Wretched Memories.
So this was a series before. I've been at San Jose State University for 5 years. Before coming here, I lived in Minneapolis for 14 years. So in addition to everybody being really shocked and outraged by the murder of George Floyd, I was especially shaken because that was my home. And even though, I was born in Atlanta, raised in Georgia, I lived in Minnesota for so long, I identify as a Minnesotan now. So I was just trying to figure out, how can I comment about this? One of my faculty members, Dr. Wendy Thompson-Taiwo, also lived in Twin Cities for a while. We were having a conversation about the events, and she was talking about her time in Minnesota was wonderful and wretched. So some really good things about it, some really bad things. And I kind of like, that's interesting. So why don't we just talk to other people about their experiences of race in the Twin Cities? And so this is what this series is. It's a series of 21 different essays by folks who lived in the Twin Cities but now live elsewhere. So they're reflecting back on their experiences in the Twin Cities to try to give people some context about why that particular, these events happen in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yes, again, this is great. This gives us, again, an understanding. How can we learn more? Reading these narratives, reading these stories, and listening to the voices, oftentimes of the voiceless. And to go with that, none other than Dr. John Singer and his great work, covering the experiences of Black male college athletes. You want to share with us a little bit about that, as well as Money Making Conversations?
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, please do check out my book. It came out in November 2019. I know some people on this call have the book and have given me some feedback on it. And certainly I'm excited about the power and potential of the book. So support a brother, check it out. In terms of money-making conversations, Brother Rushion McDonald, who used to be the brand manager for Steve Harvey, invited me onto his money-making conversation podcast to talk about the book. And there's a link here for that. And I'm proud to say that through his Cafe Mocha radio show, they just named me as one of 12 recipients of the SWAG Award, which really celebrates Black men who seek to empower others in their community through the work that we do. And so, you know, there's some big time folks in the Black community who are on this particular Money Making Conversations podcast and also on this particular award for this year. And so these are household names in the world, but I'm just a household name in the Singer family. So I'm just trying to get on their level one day, but I was proud to be named that. And then the last thing, in my work here at A&M, we've launched what we call the CEHD Equity and Social Justice Collective to really unite scholars across the disciplines in our college who are doing equity-focused work, and to also produce that practical, technical, and emancipatory knowledge that will help effectuate change through our actions and programming. And so I'm excited about that and looking forward to us doing great things from that work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I wanted to get through those resources again to take a moment for us to provide, again, quick responses to these questions that our attendees have provided. And Deniese, I think you saw one that really spoke to you. So if you want to feel free to start with that, please do.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a question that I had answered, but the question was, what was the name of the college that I mentioned earlier? And that was Beloit College, for those folks who didn't catch it. And I put it also in the chat feature. And then there's the other question that is from Min Sung Kim here. And the question says, what would you do or act to improve racial equity, not just for Blacks, but for all marginalized racial groups and Black women and other women of other colors? Can you or we work together with other racial groups who are not even shown in the statistical data because the percentages are so low? Ergo, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and I would also venture to say Native American people.
Great question. Before you even get to it, just want to highlight what has she done. She has collaborated with myself in creating Sister to Sister, where we worked to sort of dismantle and engage and empower Black female college athletes when we were at Texas A&M University. And so there's some writings on that work and those efforts that we've done. So I have to give praises to Deniese for her just amazing sisterhood in this space, but again, speaking again for the voiceless and supporting the engagement, empowerment, and development of young women. Now, free.
That you are definitely one of my day ones before I had the fancy doctor title. And so to help answer this question, and I also throw it out to the other panelists too, but my just immediate reactions when I read this is, can we work together? Yes, right? Is my immediate response. And so what can we do to improve racial equity for all of us is we have to, again, get people on board who care about racial equity and racial justice, first and foremost. And the ways to do that would be through our hiring practices, but also, like we've mentioned in the beginning, we have to do cultural shifts. But if you're someone who's like, okay, I can't affect my entire institution, I can only impact maybe my college, or I can only impact, my only sphere of influence might be like my department. So how do I do that? So I would say first and foremost, work within your sphere of influence and work with other people who are like-minded, who care about equity and justice. And so in essence, working together to try to get that critical mass of people so that you can start to, if you are, for example, a faculty member and you serve on search committees, make sure you get on them, right? Make sure you, even though it's a lot of work, and trust, I've chaired a search committee before, making sure that you can get on those committees and make sure that the tools that you use to hire people are rooted in justice, right? A lot of times these search committees won't have rubrics, or they don't use like rubrics, or they essentially have inequitable practices largely driven to like reproduce themselves, right? And so that's also why we have, you know, the same types of people represented in programs. That's why there's an overrepresentation of white folks in every industry, every college, or whatever. It's not because Black people or other people of color aren't qualified. It's not that we won't go to an undesirable place, because trust and believe, I've lived in all kinds of places, from Salt Lake City, Utah, to Brattleboro, Vermont, to College Station, Texas, to, you know what I'm saying? So, and so it's that we have to, we can't treat, and I'm gonna probably quote inappropriately, but try my best to quote a colleague of mine, Dwayne Wright, who said, when we treat white people like they're a dime a dozen when it comes to hiring, and we treat people of color like they're unicorns, right? And that's just not true. It's not true. There are many of us who do a lot of this work, who you can find and you can hire effectively and appropriately. The same thing for your recruitment practices for students, for staff, for administrators, all of that. If we can get the right people in the positions who, again, can speak to equity and justice in these ways, that is one way that we can work together to do this work together.
Thank you. Muted, Dr. Keeler.
You're on mute, doctor.
I know, I'm having a full conversation with myself right now. So, but I want us to go ahead and close out. This has been an amazing, amazing program. But I want you all as panelists to give our audience just one takeaway that they should get from this program today. We're coming from all walks of life, different levels of development, ages, and lived experiences. What is one thing you want our audience to take away from today's program? And we'll start with Denise, real quick, 30 seconds.
I'll make it 15 seconds. I would just say, because I did speak a lot, I will say, you have a voice. You do have power, even if you think that you don't, you do. You just have to learn how to cultivate it and exercise it, but you do. And so if you're someone who believes in racial justice and in equity, there are other people who believe in it too. And so I think if anything, if you can take one thing away, just know that you can affect institutional change.
Thank you. Thank you. Dean Jacobs.
I'll say that it's important, if you believe in social justice in many forms, you know, racial justice, gender equity, class equity. If you're a person that has power, if you're privileged, use your privilege for change. You know, if you're a man, speak out against sexist behavior. If you're a white person, you know, speak out against white privilege. So if you have privilege, use it to further social change.
Jamall Kinard.
I would just say that when culture is hidden, false narratives thrive. Therefore, when power is invisible, racism thrives. So in order for us to begin to make the invisible visible, we have to begin to study our institutions, and we have to study the culture that feeds into their institutions, and those are the isms. Capitalism, racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, colonialism. We got to be real in talking about those things. So let's make the invisible visible, because when power is invisible, racism thrives and we never get to the truth. So let's do that, and let's make history now. Let's do that together and follow that problem solving wheel. That's how we can begin to organize both in and out of systems, and personally be willing to unlearn what the culture and narratives have taught you about yourself, and be open to relearning new information about the truth. I look forward to joining you all on that journey. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing. And last and certainly not least, Dr. John Singer.
So we live in very perilous times, as you all know, and we see what's going on. But for me, the beauty of it is the late, great Sam Cooke once saying, it's been a long time coming, but a change gonna come. And that's what we see happening. And so I think we need to weather the storms that are sure to come and be bold enough to speak truth to so-called perceived power and real power as we go forward in this work.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, for listening to these amazing, amazing panelists and scholars. I'm just going to end with this final quote here, and a charge. Again, this notion of moving from words to action. Race and racism is a reality that so many of us grow up learning to just deal with. But if we ever hope to move past it, it can't just be on people of color to deal with it. It is up to us, to all of us, Black, white, everyone, no matter how well-meaning we think we might be, to do the honest, uncomfortable work of rooting it out. Thank you all, and we'll see you on our next Sport Conversation for Change.